Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to make the second and last part of like a video of that series where I'm just teaching you guys how to make a simple CRUD application using React, Node, and MySQL. So in the last video we left off by basically just making here our application be able to insert stuff. So we have our database, and for example we can come here and say I can add someone. Let me add Jake. Jake is like 6 years old. We can add a country, Brazil. We can add a position. Let's say it's a UX designer. We can put a wage. Let's say that the person actually earns $7 a year. And let's add Jake as one employee. If we want to see all of the different employees in our application, we can just click on the button Show Employees. Actually, oh damn, wait, I didn't start my server. Sorry about that, but I can run my server here. Node index.js, and yeah, it's saying yeah, your server is running. If I click add employee, it should add. You can see it right here. If you click on show employees, it will show all the different employees we have in our database. You can see these are all employees that we created previously, and Jake over here is the one we just created. So we're now able to insert, delete, and update stuff in our database. And no, not update and delete. We're just able to read and insert stuff in our database. So in this video, I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible because updating delete isn't something that is that like time consuming. And just want to make it as straightforward as possible so you guys can clearly understand how to do it. So basically, you know that our application, as per the previous video, it's divided between the client folder and the server folder. And in the server folder, we have the index.js, and I'm going to open it here. This is where we make all of our requests. We currently just have a post request to insert stuff, and we have a get request to read all the info in our database. We have to make more requests, right? We're going to make a request to update. So for example, app.put. And we also need to make a request to delete, like app.delete, right? These are the two other requests that we have left. Well, what is an app.put? Where basically it's just a request that we are able to update stuff in our database. So let's create a route for this request. Let's just call this update. You usually don't even need to put like a name here because since it's a put request, like for example, I could have two requests in the same route if one of them were a post request and the other was a put request. So for this purpose, let's just call this update. And we put a comma just like we did to the other ones and just like call a request and a response, and let's write out our function here. So here we want to basically just grab all the information related to an update. And by delete, it's a bit different. So for now, let's just comment this out, and I'll show you guys when it comes time to show you how to work with delete. So basically, how are we going to update a user? So let me get my database here. I'll open up my database. I forgot to do that before the video. I'm going to open up my MySQL workbench, and I'll show you guys something I want to explain. Okay guys, so here's my database. You can see clearly here we have all of our information. We have our table called employees. And how are we actually going to update something? Well, there's the update statement in MySQL, which basically allows us to update a column or an element in the database, given that we know something about that column. So that might seem a bit confusing, but for example, if we want to update my wage, which currently, this is me, right, Pedro, and I want to update my wage to be 9,000. How do I do that in code? Well, I'll say update the column or the row that has a user with the ID 1, so it knows it's me because only I have the ID 1, and it will tell it to update the wage to 9,000. So that's the basic idea. We'll identify which row we want to make the change by passing the ID in the statement. So let's try doing that. Let's come here and remember how we got info from the front end. We actually just said rec.body.theinfo, right? And we passed that through the post request with Axios, or the request with Axios. So let's imagine in our front end we're gonna pass the ID. So let's create a variable called const ID equals to rec.body.id. We obviously haven't created anything in the front end to pass this, but we're gonna do it in a moment. So we're gonna pass the ID. Then we're going to come here and say db.query, and we're going to make the statement. So how do I make an SQL statement to update stuff? Well, I'll say update set the name of the table which is employees. We're gonna put the column. So for example, I want to update the column. What do I say? What do we want to update? Yeah, let's update the wage. So I want to update the wage that the person has, right? So I want to update wage, the column wage equals to question mark, where ID equals to question mark. So if that's confusing, I'll explain. So we want to update something in the table employees. That thing that we want to update is the wage. We want to set it equal to question mark. And if you remember from the previous video, what is question mark? It's basically, we don't want to add the variable directly into the string we're making the SQL statement. We can put question marks, and if we add an array next to it with variables, the order of the variables are the order of the question marks. So for example, here we have wage equals to question mark, where ID is equal to question mark. If we came here and we passed an array, and the first element in the array is the wage. So for example, let's pass a new wage we want to have. And by the way, I just forgot, in the front end we'll have an input, for example right here, where we can write the new wage we want, and we want to get that wage as a variable. So const wage equals to rec.body.wage, right? And if it's confusing for now, don't worry. We're in a moment, we're gonna do the front end and you'll understand what we're doing. So we're gonna pass the wage and we wanna pass the ID. So basically it's gonna change the wage to whatever we pass here in the row which has the ID that we're gonna pass here. And both of this information are gonna come from the front end. So after we do this, we wanna do as always and get the error, if there's any error, and get the result, if there's like the result of the query. Then at the bottom, let's just as always, if error, so when check if there's an error, we want to console log the error. And if there isn't, let's just send the result. So else, let's just send res.send result. Okay, so now that we have our request to update ready in the backend, we can basically come to the front end, which is this app.js. This is fully React over here, as you can see. And we can start working with how we're going to update a user, right? So basically, you can see when we say show employees, each employee in our database appears here. So let's imagine maybe I want to update John Fish's wage. There should be an input right here and a button, which if I click on the input and I put a new wage and I click update, it should update the value, right? So how do I do this? Well, I can come here to where I'm listing everything. This is where I'm going through every element in the database and I'm displaying it with this kind of like as rectangles, right? This is where I do it. Well, for each element in the database, I want to have an input and a button. So let's create a div here. This div will have inside of it all the stuff related to updating. So for example, we will want an input of type text equal to text, so text. And we might want, I'll also add a placeholder here, placeholder, we'll say like 20,000, something like this. This is just 2,000, but that's okay. So it's just a placeholder. You can see right here, our input appears right here. So what else should we do? Well, we might want to add a button inside of this div. So let's add a button. And the button will say update, right? And let's take a look. You'll see that obviously it looks horrible because our project isn't responsive at all, and also it's just like how it is. So this is our button right here. How do we actually make it so that it appears at the bottom? I want to make it so that the inputs and the buttons appear down here instead of to the side here. Well, we're gonna come here and we're gonna divide this into a div. So we're gonna wrap all the information we have into a div. So that now, this is how it looks. Actually, I prefer it this way. I was gonna make it in a different way, but this way is better. So we have the information over here, and we have the button and the input right here. So that's great because now we can just put everything as we want. So we can put the value we want here. I want to change my wage to 990,000. I'll click on update and it will change it on the database. So let's come here. I'll also open up the CSS a bit, and honestly, I'll change this so that it's just input because I want the input here to have the same like styling as this inputs right here. And again, I don't worry. I'm not worrying a lot about styling. If you want to see more videos about styling, I have a bunch of them, so like I can spend more time working with CSS later. So you can see we have for each of the items in the database, we have an input and a button saying update. Now, how do we grab this value? Well, just like we did for the other inputs, we're going to create a state which is going to be called new wage. So const new wage set new wage equals to use state, and the new wage will be as a number as well. So we have a variable called wage and we have a variable called new wage. Both of them are states. What does that mean? Well, we're going to grab the value from the input and set it equal to the new wage. So if we came here and we grab this input, we're going to do the same thing we did for all the other inputs. We're going to add an onChange event. I'm just going to copy from this one right here. We're going to paste it over here. And the input, instead of setting the wage, it will set the new wage equal to event.target.value. Meaning that whenever we write something, I'll click on show employees again. Whenever we write something here, it is setting our variable new wage equal to whatever we wrote inside of this input. So that's great. Now, let's come right here and let's set it so that we have a button that when we click on it, we do something. Well, what did we do for the other stuff? Like when I click add employee, what happens? Well, I call a function, as you can see right here. It's called add employee. So let's create a function called update employee. Right below like we have both of them. We have add employee and we have get employees, right? So let's come here and create a function called update employee wage, something like this, equals to the syntax of a function. And over here, I want to make the XUSE request. And as you recall, it's a put request. So I pass here the same URL we passed before, but we're going to make a change. Remember that in this put request, I passed the route update. So let's pass the route update. And now we can also pass an object. Remember I mentioned here that we're getting from the front end an ID and a wage. Well, we want to pass the wage and the ID over here, so we have a connection between our front end and our back end. So how do we pass this? The same way that we actually passed on our post request. We pass an object containing this information. So let's come here and pass an object. So wage is equal to the new wage. So here's where we get the value that we're writing on the input. So wage is equal to new wage. And ID is equal to ID. And now this might seem confusing. Well, what is ID? Because each database here, like each element in the database has a different ID. So I can't just create a variable called ID and it will hold all the different information for the ID, right? Yeah, you won't do this. What we will actually do is, remember, for each element in the database over here, a different button is created, a different input is created. So what we can do is, basically, inside of our onClick event of our button, we're going to pass, so onClick, we're going to call the function right here. So we're going to call the function. We're going to call the function, what is the name is update employee wage. But instead of not having any arguments, we're going to pass the ID through the arguments. So if we come here to the top, update employee wage, we'll have an argument an argument called ID. And where do we get that ID? Remember that we're mapping through every element in the database, and every element has a different ID as we looked over here. So how do I access it? The same way we access the name, the age, the country, the position. As you can see right here, those are a column in a database, in a table, just like ID. So I can just come here, and instead of passing ID, I can just pass value.id. So now each element here, and I'll show you guys. I don't know if that will show. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, it's not showing individually, but basically each button created inside of each one of these boxes has a different onClick function. Why? Because it's passing into the arguments of the function that exists on the onClick a different value, their individual ID. And this is how we actually recognize which element we're updating. And I hope it makes sense to you guys. I know this might seem a bit confusing, but we're just passing the ID into the arguments, and that's how we're actually knowing which element in the database we want to delete, right? So after we make this request, we want to grab a .then because it's a promise. We get the response. We make a function, and for now, let's just alert a message saying update, something like this, right? We're just making this this thing work. So we can actually test this now to see if it works, right? So let's test to see if it works. How do we test this? I'm going to restart my server because we made a bunch of changes to index.js. I just restarted it at the bottom here. And now let's refresh our page. Let's show employees. Let's try to update one. Let's try to make it so, like, I currently earn $800,000 a year, which is pretty high. So let's be more realistic and put a number a lot higher. So let's say that I want to get, I don't even know what number that is, and I want to click on update. So let's look at our console log to see if any errors appear. Let's click on this isn't an error, this is just a warning. Let's click on the button. Apparently no error appeared. That's great. Let's look at the requests. A request is pending. So why is it pending? It hasn't been finished yet. Let's take a look. Why isn't it finishing? Well, let's take a look to see if it updated it shouldn't have updated. Yeah, it didn't update. The request didn't finish. That's extremely weird. So let's take a look at why this happened. So let's close this. Let's open this over here. Why? Oh, we got an error. What is the error? Oh my god, I just made a super dumb mistake. It's not update set employees. It's update employees set. Yeah, it didn't even make sense. So if you caught that before me, yeah, praise to you. I don't know what was happening to me, but basically you need to update the table employees and set the wage equal to this, where ID is equal to that. This is the correct syntax. Sorry about that. A subscriber told me that it's nice that I make this kind of errors, because if you're watching a YouTuber who doesn't make an error while they're making their video, definitely they have a different computer right next to the camera where they're looking the code already written. So I don't have that. I'm trying to simulate exactly how I write my code. So that's, I think, is kind of good, right? So let's run again and let's try updating my wage to 1 billion again. So I'm gonna click here. I'm gonna open my inspect element. Let's open the network so we can see if our request is done. I'm gonna click on update, and as you can see, it already said update, meaning it worked, right? So no error appears. Now let's go to our database and see if this changes to 1 billion or whatever number I wrote. And as you can see, it changed, and that's awesome because it means it's working. But it didn't change over here. So why didn't it change over here? Well, basically, if I refresh the page, it will change. If I click on show employees again, it will change. That means that it just needs to refresh the page. And that means because we're updating it on the database, but we're not actually updating it on the list directly. So if you want to update on the list directly, there's many ways you can do this. One way you can do this is by using the map function, and I'll show you guys what this means. Basically, over here, after the update employee wage is equal to, after we make the request to update, we want to set the employees list. And this might seem a bit confusing, but this is just this is not required. I'm just showing you guys how to change this value immediately when you click on the button. Just like I did with adding a new employee every time you click on the button. Like if you refresh the page, it will work, but I'm going to show you guys how to just change this immediately when you click on the button. You don't need to worry. If you want to skip this, this is a bit more advanced. So we're going to say set employee list, and inside of here we're going to grab the employee list again, and we're going to map through the employee list by grabbing the value, right? We're going to grab the value. We're going to map through every element in the employee list. And the idea is we're going to check to see if the employee list is equal to, so if the value is equal to the current, if the value, so value is equal to an employee in the database, in the table, right? So we're going to check if the ID of the value for each element in the database is equal to this ID right here. So the ID of the element we want to change. Why? Because if it isn't, then remain the same wage it was before. If it is actually the employee we want to change the wage, then let's change it. So how do I do this? I say return, and I ask if value.id is equal to ID. If it is, then I want to basically return the same value. So I want to return an object again, which contains the value. So ID is equal to value.id. The name is equal to value.name. The country is equal to country value.country. This might be sounding a bit confusing. So again, if you're confused by this, then I would recommend skipping through to when I talk about the delete part, because this isn't necessary. This is a little bit more advanced. So we're just updating. We're basically saying, well, for if the employee that we reached in this list is equal to the employee that we want to change the wage, we want to ask if the ID is equal to the one we want to change. Then we will actually turn that element into the following object, which is basically a user with the same information as previously, but at the end, and I'm just adding here the values that already existed. So vol.age, and what else did we add? We had position, so position is equal to vol.position. What do we have at the end? Well, the wage won't be equal to vol.wage. It would actually be equal to new wage. So wage is equal to new wage. So let's check this out. Wait, actually, I just, like, we made a question, we need to make an else statement. So at the end, if it isn't the user that we want to change the wage, so else, we just pass vol. So that's basically the idea. Let's refresh this. Now let's try to update, for example, John Fish. We want to change the wage to $200. Let me click on update. You can see it changes automatically here. And in our database, if we query this, John Fish now has $200. By the way, if you don't know who John Fish is, he's actually just a YouTuber. He makes really cool content. If you want to check him out, check him out. He's a lot more famous than I am, so you probably already know him. But that's where I'm taking like the names. So this is the basic idea. Now that we got off this rabbit hole of making this a little bit more complicated than it should be, let's start working with the delete. Right? We want to delete something in the database. So just like I did with the update. I want to create a button that is going to be that the user is going to be able to click on it, and when you click on it, it's going to delete something in the database. So how do I do this? Well, if I come here, when I come to the same mapping, inside of here, I want to pass a new button. So this button will basically just say delete. Let's take a look, and now a new button saying delete appears here. When I click on this button, I want to delete everything. That's very simple and straightforward. How do I do this? Let's create a function up here. Just like we did with all the other ones, it's going to be const delete employee. It's equal to this, so just like the syntax of a function. And over here we're going to make an axios.delete request. But that's something that you might be like, this is something a little bit different from the other ones. If you worked with routes before, then you know that you can pass params to routes. So what is params? Well, imagine I'm here in my local host, right? And I'm trying to access a route called user. But I want to access the user with the name Pedro. So one way I can do this is basically I can pass here user Pedro. And this right here would be the params. I would grab this in my code, whatever I wrote here, and I would know that the user is called Pedro. Usually what happens is, for example, if you go to Instagram on your computer, you'll see that your username would be something like here. So for example, mine is this right here. It's something like this. So this is at the top of my URL. This is how they're getting which users, like user profile page you're trying to access. So what does that mean? When you make a delete request, you can't pass a body. So we can't, for example, we want to delete based on the ID, just like what we did with update. So we can't pass the ID like we passed over here. So how are we going to pass the ID? Well, we're going to pass it on the parameters. So how do we do this? We're going to come here, we're going to say localhost. Actually, we need to, let's just copy this. And in the backend, let's create a route which says delete. So something like this. And we also want to pass the params. So how do we pass the params? We pass it over here. And for example, I could pass ID here and it should work, right? No, because ID is just a text. We want to pass the ID of the user we're trying to delete currently. So let's do it like we did with update. Let's get ID on the argument here of the function, and on the onClick event, let's pass a function which basically calls the delete employee, and it passes the vol.id. So We're grabbing the ID and passing it on the argument so we know which user we're trying to delete. So now that we have the ID, how do we actually pass this variable inside of here? How do we pass a JavaScript variable inside of a string? Well, if you know a lot of JavaScript, you know that you can just change the type of quote to this kind of quote over here. And now if you put a $sign over here, if you put a $sign and the curly braces, now you can insert JavaScript variables here. For example, I'll put ID. And now we're making a request to the localhost 3001/delete/ the individual ID you want. What does that mean? Well, let's go to our backend here and let's create a route for the delete. Remember, we started here, so let's create one. And how do we create this route? Remember, we called it /delete. But differently from the other routes where I just say /update or /employees or /delete, I'm actually going to put another slash, put colons, and the name of the variable I'm going to get with the parameters. So we're passing the ID. Let's just create a variable called ID. So now when I make a request that has /delete/ something, whatever I put over here is going to be accessible on a variable called ID. So how do we do this? Let's try it. So let's say rec and res, just like we did with the other ones. And over here, we're going to create a variable called ID equal to rec. And instead of .body, like we did with the other ones, we're going to do .parems.id. So the .id means this right here. So we're passing the ID through the parameters. This is, I know this might seem like a confusing topic, but it's like very straightforward. This is the only thing you need to know about this. You want to access a variable in the parameters of your request, just do it like this. So now we can just come here to the bottom and make a delete, right? So how do we make a delete? Let's say db.query. Instead of here, we can pass an SQL statement that is going to delete something from the database. How do we delete something from the database? Well, we can say delete from the name of the table, employees, where ID equals to question mark. So basically we're saying we want to delete something, a row from the employees table, but the row we want to delete is the one which has the ID equal to question mark. And as I told you guys in the other ones, we have a question mark. So how do we pass a variable over here to this question mark? Well, we just pass the value right here. So for example, ID. And you might be wondering, well, you didn't pass an array this time. You passed an array here. You passed an array on the post request. Yeah, because I had more than one check mark or question mark. If you only have one question mark in your statement, just pass it as a normal variable instead of an array. You can pass it in as an array as well of one element, but just pass it normally because that's the standard. So now let's grab the error and the result, just like we did with the other ones, and let's basically just come here and like if error, let's ask if error, then console log error. And by the way, this if error console log error, this is what told us that we had an error in the SQL back in the video, like in this video. So this is why we do this. So else res.send result. Well, we're sending the result. So now we're making this delete request and we should see it working. So let's see. I'm going to run my server again, node index.js here in my terminal. Let's refresh the page. Let's show employees. I want to delete John Hopkins. I don't like its name, and it's also the CEO. So let's delete it. Let's click on this. Let's see if John Hopkins, which previously existed, now is deleted. Apparently it is. It doesn't exist in our database anymore, meaning it's deleted. So this is the basic idea, but I'm not gonna finish the video right now because I want to show you guys. Because you realize that John Hopkins actually is still here, just like with update. I need to delete it on the database, but I also need to delete it from our screen immediately without having to refresh the page. Because if I refresh the page and I try to show employees again, John Hopkins won't be here. However, I want to immediately delete that. However, just like the update one is a bit complicated. So if you don't want to see that, this is the end of the video basically. So if you want to see how to do that, let's go on and I'll show you guys. Well, differently from the update one, we're going to use a filter method. So we're going to come here to our access.delete and we're going to do the same thing with a dot then and a response. Doesn't actually need a response, but we're just going to get it. So after we delete it from the database, what do we do? Well, we're going to do the same thing we did for update, but instead of mapping through the elements in the database, in the object, in the array, sorry, we're actually going to filter. So let's say set employee list equal to employee list dot filter. And by the way, this is assuming you know what map and filter are. These are two JavaScript functions, really important. But if you don't know that, then that's why I'm saying that like this is more of an intermediate topic. We're gonna map through every element in the array, and we're gonna grab a value, just like we did for the other one. So literally, what filter does is if we gotta return something, right? Well, the values we return are the ones that are going to be deleted. So which value do we want to delete from our array? We want to delete the value which includes an ID equal to the ID we're passing here at the top. So we can just return vol.id equal to ID. So I know that might seem weird, but I'll tell you why. Because if this condition is satisfied, so if the ID of the element in the database, so meaning we're mapping through every element in the table or in the list, right, in the employee list. If we reach an element or a person, an employee in the list which has the ID equal to the ID we want to delete, then we want to filter that out. For all the other ones, this condition won't be met, so it won't delete them. So let's see how that works. Let's try to delete, for example, let's delete Jake. I'm gonna click on delete. Damn, wait, what happened? I did it backwards. Sorry about that, guys. I did it backwards. So I accidentally deleted everything but Jake. So how do we fix that? We actually come here and just say not equal instead of equal. Sorry about that. So if I want to delete Jessica Barnes, I click on this, and now Jessica Barnes is gone, and all the other ones are here. So that's the basic idea of what we wanted to do. I really hope I didn't confuse any of you guys. I'm here to answer questions anyways, so if I know this, I try to make this a little bit more complicated than the previous CRUD videos I made, because I didn't explain this kind of stuff, like being able to immediately delete and update stuff. So that's why it might seem a little bit more advanced, but it's not actually. This is something that it should start, like, you should start tipping your toes with like more complicated React stuff. And yeah, I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. So if you have any questions, leave the comment down below, and subscribe if you want to see more, because I'm posting every single day. Leave a like because I would really appreciate it, and I see you guys next time.